Hello, guys. I got a new microphone, which sounds a lot more clearer than when I didn't have the microphone. So hopefully the audio is going to be a little bit better. It might be a little loud, so you might need to turn it down at times. All right. But we're going to go ahead and get started back into our nervous system PowerPoint, where we're looking at kind of the second half of the nervous system here. In this part of the nervous system chapter, we're going to be looking at more of the brain stuff than the microscopic. So most of the microscopic stuff with the neurons and the cells, that was all in the first part. The second part looks at parts of the brain. We'll get into like brain injuries and brain disorders, the parts of the brain and like what they're responsible for. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at here in part 2. Alright, so since we're going to be focused primarily on the brain, okay, hopefully you remember that the brain is part of the central nervous system along with the spinal cord. And so the central nervous system, or the CNS, is going to develop pretty early on within a baby's development. All right, so we see that the central nervous system develops from something called the embryonic neural tube. And when a fetus is first formed, okay, you have this tube that is running down your back. That tube is going to be what forms into the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. Now, within this particular tube, there's a couple different openings, and the openings of this neural tube are going to become what we call ventricles. And the word ventricles usually refers to either empty spots or chambers within a particular organ. In this case, it's going to be referring to the 4 chambers within the brain. And so your brain is not one solid organ. Okay, there are gaps in it, there are spaces within it. In class, I might call you guys airheads, but it's not technically air that's filled with it. Instead, there's going to be this fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and that fluid is going to be responsible for making some of the connections and then providing kind of like a cushion around the brain, okay, to protect it. The picture below, you can kind of see some development of the brain. So your nervous system actually starts to develop within the first 3 weeks. Okay, so right around the 3-week mark. At this point, most people don't even realize that they are pregnant at that time. But that is when you see your brain and your spinal cord start to develop. Okay, now it's not technically a true brain at this point. It's just the very beginnings of your nervous system. But you can kind of see the progress there as that opening and as that part of the neural tube actually begins to form into this brain, as you see here. Now your brain will continue to develop after a baby is born. Okay, so that continues to develop, which is why you have the sutures in your skull, if you remember from our bone chapter. Okay, so those sutures, super important so that brain can continue to develop, continue to grow, and adapt to all the things that babies have to learn right away as soon as they're basically born. Okay. All right, so when we get into the brain, there's these vast regions of the brain. So the first major region of the brain is called the cerebrum. Sometimes they're called cerebral hemispheres. This is going to be the largest part of the brain, and it's the part of the brain that, well, most people think of. It's like the part that has all these wrinkles on it. The second major region of the brain is the diencephalon. Now, the diencephalon you cannot see from the outside. It is on the innermost portion of the brain. So if you were to cut a brain in half, then you could see the diencephalon. But it sits right here in the middle. This dark purplish blue color sits right in the middle of the brain. Okay. You also will have your brain stem, okay, which is going to basically connect your brain and your spinal cord. Your brainstem is going to control a lot of your like primitive survival functions. So it'll include like your ability to breathe and for your heart to beat and for digestion. A lot of that involuntary stuff is actually going to be housed within the brainstem. And then the last little part here, well, not so little, is the cerebellum. Okay, the cerebellum is in the back of your head, right where like the base of your skull is, where your head and your neck connect. That's pretty much right where your cerebellum is. There are these 2 peach-sized mounds at the top of the brainstem. You can see them right here. They tend to have They also tend to have the wrinkles, but they are finer, okay, and they're closer together. And this cerebellum is going to control a lot of the really like fine and refined movements of the human body. A lot of the coordination aspect of the human body is found within that cerebellum. There's a lot of times where they will look at athletes' brains, and they have found that, and this trend is fairly consistent, although not perfect, the larger someone's cerebellum is, the more coordinated or athletically motivated they might be. I know that LeBron James, they did a brain scan on him. He had one of the largest cerebellums of the humankind that we have found thus far. Okay, although a lot of people aren't getting brain scans, but his was significant compared to other people's. Okay. The one thing that I see students like mess up on when we get into regions of the brain, and it's because the words sound similar. So the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Okay, so cerebrum, cerebellum. Cerebrum is the big part. It's the majority of the brain. Cerebellum is in the back. Okay, cerebellum's this little compared to the cerebrum, smaller part here. Okay, in the back. I would make note because I see students mix those up a lot. Cerebrum, the big part, cerebellum, part in the right base of your skull. Okay. All right, so if we take a look at the cerebrum, so the cerebrum is sometimes called the cerebral hemispheres, and that's because your brain actually has, well, two parts to it. It has a right and a left part to it. And there's actually a dividing line between the right and the left side of your brain. Okay, sometimes we also refer to these as the lobes of the brain. Now with the right and left side, I also hear this a lot too, and sometimes this comes in with like personality tests and things like that. But when someone says, I'm right-brained or I'm left-brained, not totally accurate, because you actually need both sides of your brain to operate, and neither side is specific enough to one or the other. So a lot of times people say, oh, one side of my brain, and I'm forgetting which one it is at the moment, one side of the brain controls like the creative process, and the other side controls like the logical thinking. Not so true. Okay, so it's actually multiple parts of your brain that control those functions, okay, or those characteristics, maybe is a better word for it. Okay, so the whole I'm right-brained, I'm left-brained, fun personality like quiz, but not totally anatomically correct. Sorry to like burst your bubbles. Okay. Now, the hemispheres between the right and the left lobe are going to be connected by this membranous-like structure called the corpus callosum. Okay, so there's like this thin membrane that connects both sides of the brain, and when you look at it, it doesn't look like much. Okay, it looks kind of like just some tissue, but that tissue is actually pretty important because it helps to connect and spread messages back and forth to the right and the left. You might have heard of people getting surgery on their corpus callosum before. So people who are epileptic, okay, they have epilepsy, they have epileptic seizures. If they have severe seizures, meaning that they are having seizures consistently and they're grand mal seizures, there is a surgery out there where they will go and they will cut parts of the corpus callosum to reduce the seizures. But typically that is not recommended unless their epilepsy is at a stage where it is so severe that person cannot function on a day-to-day kind of basis. Okay. All right, so your cerebrum, as I said, is the majority of the brain. It makes up 2/3 of your brain's mass, and everything that you see that has color on it right here in this diagram is considered part of the cerebrum. Okay, so it's the majority of your brain. Okay. Now, you notice the wrinkles, okay, that kind of go along with what people think of when they think of brains. And so the surface is made of these ridges and grooves. So the ridges are called the gyri, and the grooves are called the sulci. Okay, so the ridges, or like the hills of the brain, okay, are the gyri, and the folds, or those ditches, are going to be the sulci. Time check. Okay. All right, now, of course, we need to separate things out a little bit more than just this whole thing's the cerebrum, because that cerebrum has different parts that have different functions. And so when you take a brain out of the skull, which most of you have not done, and that's okay, but when you look at a brain when it's outside of a skull, it doesn't really hold its shape. Okay, it doesn't even really look like this. It almost kind of like falls apart in your hands, which is a little concerning how important it is, and it doesn't seem to be the most strong of structures. Okay, but one of the reasons why it tends to like fall out, and I'll see if I can find like a video that kind of shows this, but one of the reasons why it doesn't really hold together very well is because we have these fissures, these deep grooves that divide the cerebrum into the different lobes. So in this picture, it looks like they're all nice and put together, but in reality, the frontal lobe will have this big gap, okay? At least it'll look big. When in between that and the motor strip. There'll be some space between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe when that brain is outside of the skull. Now, when it's inside of the skull, your skull helps to keep it nice and compact, okay, which is why when someone has brain damage or when the skull is cracked, it's usually a pretty big deal. Okay. So the surface lobes of the cerebrum, so these are the ones that you can see from the outside. And lucky for us, if we remember our bones of the skull, or even the muscles of the cranium, we are good to go, okay? Because the part of your brain that is right behind your forehead, right behind your frontal bone, right behind your frontalis muscle, is your frontal lobe, okay? The parietal lobe is right underneath the parietal bone. Occipital lobe is in the back, right behind your occipital bone. And your temporal lobe is right at your temples, right behind your temporal bone. Okay, so if you were going from the inside out, obviously, no, let's go from the outside in. So obviously you would have like your skin and your flesh and your fat tissue and your connective tissue. Okay, then you would get into the skull. Oh, no. It's been a long day, apparently. Skin, connective tissue, and fat. Then you get into the muscle. Okay, so if you're going through the forehead, you get to the epicranius frontalis muscle. And then you go through the frontal bone, and then you keep going in more inward, and you will hit your frontal lobe. Okay, giving you an idea from working our way outside in. Okay, this is the inside of the brain that is cut in half. I'll be referencing this more when we get into the diencephalon, which is actually the middle part here. Okay. Now with your with your cerebrum, we've got a couple different parts that deal with like sensory stuff and motor stuff. So somatic sensory area, sometimes this is known as the sensory strip. This is going to be the part of the brain that collects all of the impulses from your body's sensory receptors. So if you touch a hot stove, if you touch a cactus that's prickly, if you grab an ice cube and it's cold, all of those senses are actually brought up into the brain through the spinal cord, of course, and interpreted. They're sent here first. Okay, right here in this sensory strip. Okay. Then you notice right next to it we have our primary motor area, which is sometimes known as your motor strip. And this is a strip that sends impulses to the skeletal muscle. So what happens is the sensory strip says, okay, this is the impulses that I'm getting. Your brain will then integrate it, and then this motor strip, which happens to be next door, which is how our brain works, which is kind of awesome, will be the ones that say, hey muscles, you need to take your hand away from that cactus. It is prickly. Okay, you need to put that ice cube in your drink because it is cold. Okay, so that is how your brain is actually going to communicate to each other, and that's one of the reasons why these strips are so close together. Okay. Then the Broca's areas. Broca's was the name of a man who had been affected in this area. So your Broca's area is going to be involved with your ability to speak. It's right here, right above your temporal lobe, almost above like your eyebrow area even, okay, towards the front of your head. That's your Broca's area, and that is going to be where your language processing, and not even just your language processing, but the ability to speak, okay, will, at least from a muscular level, will actually be formed there. We'll find that people who have brain damage in certain areas will have trouble with whatever those areas are in charge of. Okay, so if someone had a brain injury or a brain aneurysm right here, okay, that would mean that their ability to speak would be hindered. Okay, a lot of times stroke victims, this is actually an area that's commonly affected by people who have strokes. Okay. All right, my time is coming to an end, so I'll go ahead, leave off here, and then we will pick this back up tomorrow. I hope you guys are doing okay. Have a good one.